Greetings, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about some contemporary issues that merge with historical issues. And just today I did a keynote presentation for the professional day for teachers at Sand Springs Public Schools. They asked me to do this, and so I accepted and took on the challenge. With that, we're going to jump right to the computer screen, and I'm going to roll through a whole bunch of slides for you. So let's just see how this goes. Educate, don't indoctrinate. I got this title from Governor Kevin Stitt and his State of the State address, wherein, as you see the bottom quote, because when we send our kids to college, we expect our tuition to pay for their education, not their indoctrination. So what he's indicating is that we're indoctrinating y'all now that you're here. But I had to go back and look at the word indoctrination and wonder where that comes from. All the way back to the Latin. The process of teaching a person or a group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically is the contemporary definition. It didn't always start that way. It originally just meant to imbue with learning, to put learning in somebody, then instruct in a subject or principle, or to imbue with a doctrine, idea, or opinion. But what is led to now is the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And that's completely the opposite of what we want you to do here. We want you to think of everything with a critical perspective and use critical thinking. So here I am, Dr. Indoctrinator, here at Rogers State University, and I'm getting ready to take off. So let's go. What do students need to know? Schools not only teach what parents want their kids to know, but schools should also teach what society needs them to know. What does society need from educated people? That's where we're going. And sometimes liberty means telling people what they don't want to hear. I read 1984 when I was in high school. It's shaped a lot of what I've thought ever since then. That at certain points in history, things get dystopian, which means what? Really more strange and out of kilter. And as if there is only one set of rules in society, and that is of the ruling class. So as I get going on this talk, one of the things I bring up is stereotypes. And I always like to point out, I am not the Mubar Man. Even though I've had multiple people ask me if I'm the Mubar Man, I am not. The Mubar Man is on Bluebell ice cream. Okay, I have red hair and glasses and my face is kind of angular and I look sort of goofy. Okay, I'm down with all that, but that is not me. But it does bring up some interesting questions about stereotypes. So, before we get going too deeply in here, I want to make sure we're all squared away on a question that you should be able to answer. How does the U.S. Constitution address sovereignty? It specifically comes from something known as the Commerce Clause, which states that the U.S. Congress has power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with the Indian tribes. And so in that particular quote, that phrase right there, we get a confirmation of tribes as sovereign entities, along with the plenary power of Congress, meaning Congress can do stuff in any country if it wants to, and also substantiates tribal nationhood. Do you remember how many federally recognized tribes are in the state? We'll go 38. However, often you will see the number 39 because of the Yuchi, who are not federally recognized but are a separate and distinctive entity. I've mentioned before the tribal jurisdictions in Oklahoma where they are. Currently, we are in Claremore on the Cherokee Nation Reservation that happens to be within the borders of the state of Oklahoma and within the borders of the United States of America on the North American continent. Here in Oklahoma, the oldest painted object ever in North America was found out in western Oklahoma at a bison kill site, carbon dated to over 10,000 years ago. So we know that over 10,000 years ago, people were living in and around Oklahoma. Here is an image of that broken bison skull and an artist's rendering of what it might have looked like with the lightning bolt here in the center, some other little squiggly lightning bolts over here. What does it mean? We don't know, but some human being put that on there. When we talk about the early eras of Native people, in this class we've discussed how people could have migrated to this area as many as 50,000 years ago, but we know between 12 and 24,000 years ago, we have archaeological evidence that people lived in this region along the rivers. And this is also noted by the emergence of the Clovis and Folsom points. And here you see Clovis Point that would be attached to a spear. And so you see the curved part right down here would go on the end of the stick and then wrapped around. You can see a little notch here. That would be for where the string or leather goes. And then that moves us on to Spiro Mounds, 900 to 1300. We've talked about Spiro in here a little bit. We talked about it last Wednesday as being the capital of the Mississippian era's geography and the westernmost mound complex, and is located down around I-40 where it enters Arkansas near Spiro, Oklahoma. The descendants of the Spiro Mounds are the Wichita and the Caddo people, both of whom are contemporary tribal groups in the state of Oklahoma. And both the Caddo and the Wichita lived in big grass houses, not teepees. We tend to think of native people from Oklahoma living in teepees, but they didn't. And this is because they had permanent settlements where they set up a town, farmed around it. Their hunters went out and brought stuff back. So the Caddo and the Wichita are both descendants of the Spiro people, had villages and farms in the area. Then the Osage followed the buffalo into this area in ancient times. We know the Quapaw were known to the area. They're related to the Osage via their language. The Comanche, Kiowa, Plains Apache come in from the southwest to hunt, to collect flint for their arrows and spears and war expeditions. We also know there were Pawnee villages further up the Arkansas, more toward north central Oklahoma, which is ironically where the Pawnee wound up. When we talk about Plains people, of course, we are talking about the people with teepees. They were mobile. The first mobile home, you might say. But Plains people are not only some ancient group of people who no longer exist except in faded black and white photographs. This is a picture of the Kiowa Gourd Clan in Carnegie, Oklahoma, where annual ceremonies take place. This particular Gourd Clan or Gourd dance was associated with the Sundance. That was federally forbidden in 1890 by the federal government. And so Sundance went underground and actually stopped for the Kiowas. Other tribes maintained it. But they had a warrior society that helped out with the Sundance and with some other activities, and they still commemorate that today. When we talk about the Osage, the name means the children of the Middle Waters. They first met fur traders in Missouri in the 1670s. And then from the 1670s up through 1825, they were in this particular region. They sold their land in Kansas at $1.25 per acre, and with that money, bought the land they have now from the Cherokees in 1883. 5,000 Osages moved to present-day Osage Nation. We've talked about the Muskogee people, a confederation of independent, highly organized towns, mostly in Alabama and Georgia. They have ties to the Mississippian period. The mounds. Right now, there is a large mound in Okmulgee at the Muskogee Nation headquarters that is their council house. So they keep that tradition going today. The British arrive and find people living along the creeks, so they call them the Creek Indians. But that's not what the Muskogee people call themselves. And with regard to Cherokee, we get the original name Ani-Kituwagi, which is a corruption of a Choctaw word given to Spanish explorers by Choctaw guides in Cherokee country. They said something like Chalaki or Charoq, meaning the peoples in the caves or mountains. Well, that was put on these Spanish map makers' maps, and so they start replicating maps, and Charoq and Chalaki get anglicized and converted into a contemporary word, Cherokee, which is really a mispronunciation of a Choctaw word for the people who live in the caves. This happens throughout history where native people have names applied to them by Europeans who don't understand native languages. Of course, many tribes suffered tragedies at the hands of the U.S. government under the leadership of the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, and there are various names for these removals. Trail of Tears, Trail Where They Cried, the Long Walk, the Trail of Death. And here's an image from your book that indicates where the people came from and where they were at that time. Those who had not already been run off or removed in one way or another. And so you see the Muskogee people here, Cherokee people here, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and the Seminoles down here. And they're all moved to Indian Territory, which initially was just set up for those groups. So if you look at the map here, there's the Cherokee, Creek and Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, as opposed to now where it's split up among 38 tribal groups. But when we talk about the southeastern tribes, they're often called the 5 civilized tribes. Why? Because they embrace European touchstones, cultural, economic, social, and religious concepts, to include the use of slavery, specifically slaves of African descent. Not all, but some did. And it tended to be the ones who intermarried with whites. However, the incorporation of these concepts did not prevent tribes from being removed. Who's uncivilized? Well, you might say the U.S. government, because they did not honor their promises to the people. But what we're really implying here is the Western tribes. Because the Plains people are scary to the settlers. I know you guys are taking a note here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to press on, and I'll provide this PowerPoint for you. So take all the notes you want, but I'll provide it to you. I'll put it on our course shell. Of course, the Plains people are feared because they are uncivilized. And they ride horses and have bows and arrows and rifles, and they don't like people coming on their land. And if they do come on their land, then there are consequences to pay. Well, the federal government has to figure all this out at a certain point because the Plains people are already here. The southeastern removal starts to take place, and then we get some very harsh numbers. It's hard to talk about. 60,000 people forcibly removed from their homelands, and thousands of people died. Thousands. It's a history that we cannot erase nor wash away, and we need this context for especially the contemporary concept of genetic trauma, where genetic trauma comes from and how it is passed down from one group to the next genetically, and can explain some of the social ills with regard to some Native people's situations. Osages aren't happy about Cherokee being given Osage territory, so the Osage-Cherokee battles required the establishment of Fort Gibson in 1824, then the furthest point west established by the U.S. government. I realize now this slide is a little out of timeline here. We've talked about Muskogee before. I don't think I have to go through all this. Muskogee, Muskogee means plural. The V is an sound. A K, when it's between two vowels, gets the sound of a G. A K next to a vowel gets a K sound as kite, and then one E is like two E's in English. Ulgi means plural, so Muskogee, plural. Muskogee people arrived to the Tulsa area in 1836 as a result of the removal, and they take ceremonial ashes that they had brought with them all the way from their homes in Georgia and Alabama, and deposit them in a communal fire pit at the base of that tree. So that's why they have an annual ceremony at the Council at the Oak, which is at 18th and Cheyenne, to commemorate those first people who made it to the Council Oak. I like to bring this guy up, Herbert Joe Forrest. He was from a very wealthy family. He could have sold that land that the Council Oak tree was on, but instead he donated it to the city of Tulsa. Now it's on the National Historic Register. When we look at these boundaries, here's the Muskogee Creek Nation, and this is where I was today, up in Sand Springs. And they had to put a boundary line to separate the three nations. That's Edison Street in Tulsa. Goes to Choteau, then south to Fort Gibson, where you hit Highway 69. Cherokee Nation boundaries you see here, and you see clearly we are in the Cherokee Nation. There's a really interesting community here, Inola, and I think Logan. Aren't you from Inola? Yeah. Logan? Yeah. So one side of the street's Muskogee Nation, the other side of the street is Cherokee Nation. It has a really odd dividing line. It's like the border of the two nations. Osage Nation is essentially Osage County, which you see here, which is one of the larger counties in the United States. But initially that was all purchased by the Osage. And then there's been a lot of discussion as to whether or not the Osage Reservation has ever been disestablished. Won't get into that now, but during the 1830s to 1860s, the people rebuild. Cherokee Muskogee people, council houses, courthouses, schools, missions, economic development, newspapers, and so forth. Also in this period, a really interesting music develops, and it is the Muskogee Creek hymns that are brought by Scottish missionaries. They bring the tunes and the song style descending from 16th century line singing in England and Scotland. They add melodies of the people of African descent. And then the Muskogee language, which often has some double meanings. And the microtones of American Indian music. All this begins to emerge. They start between 1800 and 1830, or formalized by the 1850s, continue through the Civil War, 20th century to now. There's a lot of ways to discuss this. I could demonstrate one for you and so forth, but I really just want to bring up the subject matter to start with, because it does bring up some really interesting issues regarding the multicultural developments within the Muskogee Nation. Because people of African descent were very much part of the Muskogee world, they often became interpreters. They could speak both languages, English and Muskogee. So here you see in 1734, almost 300 years ago, a Muskogee delegation is visiting a group of the trustees of Georgia in England. But if you look right here, they take with them a small boy of African descent. He is their interpreter. They're saying what they want to say. He speaks English so he can tell them. He speaks Muskogee so he can get it back to them. But it's a really dynamic image because of what it shows you. Move forward to the 1860s, 130 years later, Alabama church members, where you can see people of Anglo-American descent, Native American descent, African American descent, and so it's a mixed environment. Goes along with the churches that are active today, and I like showing the Hutchjoba members. It's from a few years ago. As a result of that, I got interviewed by Yale University professor Willie Ruff for a documentary on Muskogee Creek hymns, and then I got to help my friend Sterling Harjo with This May Be the Last Time, which came out in 2014. And it's all about these Muskogee hymns and the impact that they have. Here you see the words in the middle, Ispogides omes kitliskos. And that means this could be the last time, we don't know. The last time, maybe, we don't know, kitliskos. So, and I'll just do a very brief thing on that. It goes, Ispogides omes kitliskos. Ispogides omes kitliskos. Chawandagi apiana. Ispogides omes kitliskos. That's an example of one of those hymns. It's probably one of the better known ones. Pastor Eugene Harjo helped me with a whole lot of understanding about all this stuff. So I wanted to throw that in there because it's a really interesting historical tangent that starts to emerge in the early 1800s. During the Civil War, Creeks and Cherokees leave their homes, farms, and towns, return to find them destroyed. Some factions fought with the North or fought with the South, and so the North penalized them. If you know the Battle of Honey Springs, which was down at Renniesville, south of Muskogee, there were blacks, whites, and natives fighting blacks, whites, and natives. As a result of all that, the carpetbaggers, railroad men, speculators come in. Then we start to evolve the freedmen issues. And the freedmen are the people who were of African descent, but often of native descent as well. And as a result of the Civil War and the treaties that were signed between the federal government and the tribes, the freedmen were to get all the rights and privileges of citizens. And they're still fighting for that today. And we'll see, it's still shaken down. Indian Territory in 1866, here we are up in Cherokee Nation, but you'll notice at this point, everything is reserved for tribes. You know, some activist has said this is the big federal prison, basically. You got sent there by the government, and you couldn't leave, which brings up the story of Standing Bear, and we'll get to that in a second. In 1882, the land was owned in common by Creeks, and Tulsa was a railhead where equipment and supplies could be stationed for further construction and merge these different railroads. The early town site of Tulsa was inhabited by one Muskogee person, Noah Partridge, who lived in a log cabin with his family. Muskogee people were more liberal about white settlement. They sold licenses to railroads and other business people, but you had to marry a Cherokee person in order to do business in Cherokee Nation. When we talk about Tulsi, it's linked to Lojabolga Tulsi, a corruption of the town Tallahassee, which is an old Creek tribal town. It's a current city or community really in Oklahoma. Modern Muskogee ceremonial ground. And we think some of these words come from Dulwa, which means town, and Edo, which means tree. So a tree where people meet. And it's similar to the 18th and Cheyenne Council Oak tree. Why they chose that? You pick a big tree everybody can see, and you know how to meet there. Hussey, compared to Tallahassee, is kind of old town or Tulsi town. I've also been told Tallahassee means nobody's there. So ceremonial activities of the Muskogee continued at least till 1890 when they were forbidden by federal law. This made it difficult for Native people to understand what this United States was about. Here you have a Bill of Rights that says the government can make no religion mandatory. That's part of our Bill of Rights. Same as freedom of speech and the right to bear arms and all that. But what did the government go and do? To Native people said, well, as long as you're a Christian, then that's okay. If you are trying to forward your native religion, that's not okay. Because as we get to one of our chapters of the book, it's kill the Indian, save the man. But still yet today, these ceremonials go on. Here's an image of what gets popularly called the stomp dance or a Muskogee ceremonial. You see the ladies wear these turtle shells around their ankles, and those are the rattles that keep the rhythm going of the dance. And you also see people out here going around in a circle. And I was given permission to take this photo in the morning. It was not a medicine dance, as they called. It was more of like a holiday dance where everybody was getting together. After the Civil War, the government turns its attention to the West, the Plains Indian Wars. That's where we get everything that happened here in Oklahoma, the Ouachita massacre site where Custer massacres innocent Native people, all the way up to the Battle of Little Bighorn, where he ultimately meets his demise. Plains Indian Wars. Once that's resolved, kill the Indian, save the man is the government slogan while enrolling Native children in boarding schools. Then we hit the enrollment and allotment process. It begins in 1890. So individual people came in, signed up, and they were awarded a parcel of land, usually 160 acres. You're a tribal citizen today. You trace your ancestry back to somebody who's on the Dawes Rolls. But there was all kinds of corruption. Native people did not have a solid understanding of either A, the value of land, or the new system that was being imposed upon them. Up to that point, Native people owned land in common, not as individual parcels. Wherever you set up your cabin and domain, that was your place. But many tribal members lose land to unscrupulous swindlers as a result of that. And I noted that in 1908, full-blooded Creeks were allowed to sell their land to non-Native Americans, and Charles Page quickly purchased large tracts of land. Several lawsuits resulted from these cheap land acquisitions, but Page was able to hold on to the lands. And then he formed Sand Springs. It was platted in 1911. It was a planned segregated community. So it had a black side of town and a white side of town. And I don't really get into a lot of the conspiracy stuff right now. I think all the documentation is still going on about Charles Page and what happened in that era. But I imagine as time goes on, we're going to find out more because people are really starting to dig into it now. The Sand Springs area came to my attention because I go through it all the time back and forth to work, and I get off all the time and eat or shop or get fuel or whatever. And I noticed this Tallahassee Creek Indian Cemetery in the middle of an Atwoods parking lot. It was very strange. It's just in the middle of a parking lot. So they built around it. And it's a final resting place for many members of the historic Tulsa Perryman family and the Sand Springs Adams family. But the cemetery contains about 20 graves, including one Creek Confederate soldier, which shows you that people were on all kinds of sides of that particular conflict, depending on their personal situation. The Perryman family is a huge family that had all kinds of land, and that essentially becomes Tulsa. But I want to bring up Weegawa for a second because I was in Sand Springs today, and I wanted to make sure I had it right. The word "we" is a shortened version of "weewa" for water in the Muskogee language. So we put "we" as a prefix followed by a word to describe the water. These town names came from where the Muskogee people lived before. And if you look at the old maps of the old Muskogee Nation, you see some of the same town names there that we have in Oklahoma because they brought them with them. And they often named their community by the feature of the water. So Weegawa means spring water. And if you look at some of these other towns in Oklahoma, Wilitka, running water, meaning the "we" part is the water, Litka is the running part. "We" is the water part, Tumpka means tumbling water. Wewoka, barking water. It's the sound the water makes. And so that's where the name for Sand Springs comes from. Weegawa, spring water, because it's right there on the Arkansas River. And they had access to water, and any kind of settlement throughout history, you needed water. And I stopped in and talked to the pastor, J.R. Wisdom of Weegawa Indian Baptist Church. And we were talking about some of these things. And this is a small community church there just west of Sand Springs. But in town, the Weegawa Center is right along Weegawa Road, but most people do not know what it means. And so I had all the teachers today at Sand Springs repeating Weegawa after me. If you don't take anything out of here, you should at least know this. Over in Osage World, Million Dollar Elm, of course, is the name of a casino now. But after the first oil strike in 1897, various oil barons came in and they would use the land and that tree to make deals, where the Million Dollar Elm, and so that's why the tribe called one of its casinos that. Thomas Gilcrease was a very important Muskogee person, got rich via oil, and is the founder of the Gilcrease Museum. After allotments and statehood, tribal governments are abolished, tribal ceremonies are outlawed, and children are forced into boarding schools where they're prevented from speaking their tribal languages. Kill the Indian, save the man. And we're still dealing with that in language issues today because parents would not come home and teach their children the tribal language because they thought it was just going to get them in trouble because they got in trouble. We move on, and here we are in the 1920s with what's known as the Osage Reign of Terror. I mentioned earlier, Osages were sitting right on top of the most wealthy minerals up to that point, alongside the Glen Pool down here south of Tulsa. Well, because Osage full-bloods were not thought competent to manage their own affairs, they were assigned conservators who happened to be of Anglo-European descent. And then those conservators signed on as their beneficiaries. And then those Osage people started to die in not so subtle ways. So this book that came out a few years ago, Killers of the Flower Moon, has now been made into a movie that was shot in the last couple years. Martin Scorsese, the great director, directed it. Leonardo DiCaprio is in it. When it comes out, it's going to point a lot of fingers right back to us again. I asked David Grand what he thought the most surprising thing about that story was. And he said, the depth and level to which the corruption went in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. Everybody was in on it because everybody was making money off of it. Doctors, lawyers, judges, shopkeepers, morticians, and so on. And this is where you get in a real tricky space in our education realm, because do you talk about it as a racial issue or is it just a socio-cultural issue? But in fact, it was Anglo-Europeans that were killing Osages. Not only that, right down the highway, 40 miles away, people of Anglo-European descent were killing people of African descent at the Tulsa Race Massacre. So we have to be able to tell our history accurately and learn from it. We can't shy away from it. And I fear that's some of what's going on. Let's not upset school-age children with some information that might upset their understanding of society. We're going to get back to that in a second too. 20th century developments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because we're going to have to get back to them again. The American Indians serving with distinction in the wars, specifically the Comanche code talkers, who used the Comanche language to get the Comanche to send coded signals behind enemy lines, and it could never be interpreted by the Germans. In the same way the Navajo language was used in the Pacific. And then earlier code talkers were Choctaws. The first ones that really figured it out were the Choctaws. It became a formal Signal Corps program by World War II. Native people aren't citizens until 1924. The Indian Reorganization Act allows tribes to reorganize in 1934. The Johnson-O'Malley Act comes along, which is the federal legislation to help fund public schools that have a lot of Native children in them. And then the termination period of the 1950s. Activism and awareness comes along and brings a lot of attention to Native issues. And Tulsa draws a lot of people to this area because of petroleum, aviation, and construction. Of course, there was a ton of money there, so a lot of things were being built. That's why we have all that great Art Deco architecture in Tulsa. Some of the first intertribal urban powwows happened in Tulsa, and Tulsa led the nation in Indian education reform. In the 70s, many Nixon-era programs helped tribes because at that point, things were not going well. But as a result of the American Indian movement and bringing attention to Native issues, we started to see some other developments that were helping tribes out. As former principal chief of Cherokee Nation, Chad Smith, used to say, when you study Native history, you get mad, you get sad, you get glad. Mad because of the way it went down, sad because of the way it went down after that, and glad because of the way things are bouncing back. But it seems like the cycle repeats sometimes when elected officials do not act as if they really understand Native American law and history. So these things come about in the 70s, Indian Self-Determination Act, all kinds of federal programs, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act, which protects burial sites, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which says if you're a Native, you can make an art and sell it as Native American art, but if you're not, you can't. Economic development and impact continues, and tribes are starting to develop their own tribal colleges. The Muskogee Nation has a tribal college. With regard to Oklahoma, race and ethnicity, white alone, 61%, black alone, 12%, Hispanic, 18%, which is the fastest growing population in the state of Oklahoma. Asian alone, 6%. American Indian and Alaska Native alone, 1.1%. That's somewhat misleading. The reason why is because often, contemporarily, Native people are made up of 2 or more races. And that gets 10%. So really, you might be looking at, a higher 8, 9, maybe even 10% population. We also have something called a diversity index here, which keeps going up. The population of Oklahoma, we would say 303,791 from 2020, 303,791. And that's Lindsay Harjo wearing a Seminole dress. So Native people are in every aspect of life, but you may not know who's Native and who's not Native because of how they look. So that's why it's important to understand what's happening, so you don't make some goofy social faux pas. That's what being educated is all about. Tribes are changing the economic, tourism, and entertainment landscape of Tulsa with gaming facilities. There's a lot of them, and they're big ones. And they bring in a bunch of money, not just for the tribes, but because of compacts with the state of Oklahoma, money goes to the state as well. The Muskogee Creek Nation Casino, the River Spirit, Osage Casino continues to expand. And gaming can be good. Jobs for tribal members, non-Indians, revenue for business and municipalities near gaming facilities, increased tourism to the Tulsa area. But it's bad because organized crime sneaks in there. Gambling can be a problem for people who can't handle it as entertainment only, and then they get sucked into the excitement of it, and then they try and make up their losses. Law enforcement, municipal services are strained by gaming centers. In 2017, the total economic impact the tribes made in Oklahoma, $12.9 billion. And In addition to direct contributions, tribes generate billions in production by companies that support tribes' business operations. Cherokee Nation gave $6 million to public schools. Of course, there's a lot of social ills in Indian country. Abuse of women and children, teen suicide, early death due to poverty, diabetes, these are all real issues. But at some point we have to start with the imagery that's in our society and how it's stereotypical and how it impacts children. The Native mascot issue is related to the overall stereotyping of Native people as one monolithic race without any distinguishing characteristics between them. Often Plains Indian imagery dominates this kind of thinking, complete with the war bonnet. And you can see here a bunch of different Native people, I think from the late 1800s, early 1900s, in their traditional regalia, and you can see some wear war bonnets, some don't wear war bonnets. Well, let's get to what a thesis does. Topic plus opinion plus controlling ideas. You need to learn this for anything you're going to do in school. You need a good thesis statement for any essay. We go topic plus opinion plus controlling ideas. So most American Indian mascots should be removed from non-Indian public schools. That's the topic and opinion, because the mascots stereotype all Native people as one monolithic race, trivialize significant cultural traditions, reinforce offensive racial terms, and encourage anti-Indian imagery. Well, what's at stake here? 1 in 5 public school students in Oklahoma is of American Indian heritage. More than 350,000 American Indian students are in Oklahoma public schools. Race-based nicknames teach all children stereotyping is acceptable in society. Some very good research indicates mascots not only diminish the self-esteem of the children to whom they're exposed, but the acceptance and promotion of the mascots by Native adults often concurs with a lack of investment or knowledge in one's own Native heritage. The more you know about your Native heritage, the less you like the mascots. The less you know about your Native heritage, the more you like the mascots, because it gives you something to identify with. If you're connected to American Indian life, you have different opinions than if you're not connected to American Indian life. And Native reality is often hard to grasp for a lot of non-Natives, because non-Natives don't experience the same type of social activities even. Never mind powwows and dances and gatherings and that kind of thing. Because when we get down to American Indian identity, it really builds on any identity. Language, ceremony or annual events, community responsibility, and participation. Once you establish what those 3 things are in your life, we know who you are. And the stomp dance, or the ceremonial songs of the Muskogee people, happen around a fire. Whereas the powwow happens around the drum. And they're completely different activities. One is from the Southeast, one is from the Great Plains. We'll look quickly at some categories of American Indian imagery. There's the authentic, made by First Nations people. Then there's the stereotypical, representing only one image of Native people, typically as Plains warriors with war bonnets. There's the commercial, positive and negative imagery, representing the business. Institutional, which is stereotypical or authentic imagery of schools, government, the military. And then that information, which is just racist and insensitive. Degrading images that depict Native American people in a demeaning light. So I go back, I found this from 1923. I'm a big music fan, and there's no Oklahoma Indian jazz I know of, unless you know about Claude Pepper. But this came out in 23, and still you have the person with the war bonnet dancing along there. And Oklahoma provides this topical paradigm. Paradigm is just an example or framework for study. Greetings from Oklahoma, there's the war bonnet. And the idea is that war bonnets aren't for everybody. Although we see them everywhere as part of commercial signage. Here's a box of apples from Seattle, Washington, which is definitely not the Great Plains, but they use a Plains native to represent their apples. We see this at the Big Chief RV Park over there by Ponca City, and out in Clinton with this HOW sign, making fun of literally how Native people say hello to one another, especially Plains people. We've always heard how. It's really more like a ho, ah ho. You'll hear that in a lot of the Plains World. It means hello. It can also mean thank you. Just depends on the context. Very interesting case came out in 2015 of the Oklahoma Lions going to their international parade where everybody wears costumes from their host country. And the Oklahoma delegation always puts on war bonnets and fake regalia. There's been a lot of discussion about this. As a matter of fact, right now, they're about to change this. It's taken a while. So that you have to be a person of native descent if you're going to wear anything like this. And you have to be able to prove it. Of course, an image like this has no place in our society, playing on the trope of the drunk native person, war bonnet holding a place to put a bottle. You know, why would somebody do this? Well, this is what natives have to confront. This whole idea of Native American mascots, although I would give a what's up or heads up to Tulsa Union, who changed theirs. That's where this image came from. They don't have them anymore. But think about Palestine. Here they are dressing up like natives with war bonnets and saying the Indian wars aren't over, Mrs. Rice, we're still here. Palestinians are saying they're the first people of Israel. Israel was awarded that land in the 1940s and became the ruling authority there. And the Palestinians got shoved off to the side. And so they equate their experience with that of the American Indian. Now you got some deeper historical stuff happening. Down in Choctaw Nation, the home of the warriors, they use a Plains war bonnet to represent their warriors, but the Choctaws are from southeastern United States. They weren't Plains people. The only people that really get to wear these things, rightfully, are Plains people, and even within those societies, only certain people get to wear those war bonnets. These are the Black Leggins Society, they're Kiowas, they're military veterans, they represent a warrior society of the Kiowas. They're the ones supposed to be wearing this, not people who are pretending. And we sure don't dress up anymore. I would also point out that in Tulsa, Sequoia Elementary School uses the Plains war bonnet to represent Sequoia because he was native, right? So let's just put a Plains Indian up there. But Sequoia didn't wear a war bonnet. He was Cherokee. Didn't look anything like that. Then we move on to some professional sports teams, which have, one has stayed around, two are gone. The one on the left is gone, the one in the middle is gone. The one on the right is still here. Any idea what that is? You guys know? That's the Chicago Blackhawks, their NHL team. And the Blackhawks are named after a Sac and Fox chief, Blackhawk, as is the Army's Black Hawk helicopter. Sac and Fox have a liaison that works with both the United States Army and the Chicago Blackhawks to make sure that their ancestors' name is used properly and in a good way. So sometimes critical thinking really is necessary to try and separate all this out. It's not just what the mascots do, it's what they incur. They incur anti-Indian imagery. Scalp the Redskins. Maybe you've seen this somewhere in the past. This is from, I think it's Minnesota. I'd have to make sure of that. But the state reward for dead Indians has been increased to $200 for every Redskin sent to purgatory. There was a bounty on Native people. So if you killed one and you proved it by bringing them or their skin in, you'd get a bounty. So how do you like that for your high school women's basketball team name? Well, some schools don't, and we've had a couple change now. But again, you see this stuff pop up all the time. Here you have an eagle about to behead a chief, which is one of the most ridiculous things you could ever see, because a eagle is thought of so highly by Native people. The feathers are used for prayer vehicles. And so here, Scalp the Chiefs, we're going to use it because the team was the Eagles that was playing them. So you have to decide, does it really matter? Or is this causing some issues for Native students? Because insensitivity runs around all over the place. Here's some OSU students who are playing Florida State. Send them home on a trail of tears. So that's to equate a football game with the thousands of people who died on the removal from the Southeast. Who's thinking? Who's thinking about this stuff? In Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, back in 2017, they dressed up some students in a fake outfit and put them in a cage for the homecoming parade. And they roll them down the street, Indians in a cage. So we have to do better as educators and advisors. Some kids do know the difference. There's a lot of different points of view. Over in Tahlequah, it took a long time to get rid of the Northeastern Red Men and this imagery that went along with it, because some native people liked it. Then there's Tommy Tomahawk, who came from Adair public schools. And not only that, but this mascot was accepted for a little while there in Adair. I want to bring up Stephanie Freiberg. She spent years studying the psychological effects of native stereotypes and logos on both Native Americans and non-natives. And this is really interesting. American Indians who approve of race-based mascots are in a certain sense the greatest victims, because Freiberg's research shows that American Indians who approve incur a greater amount of psychological harm than those American Indians who oppose them. So then I thought, well, what about this new mascot that was unveiled? This is a news story, so I'm not like telling stuff out of turn here. The new Stillwell Indians mascot, Tommy Tomahawk, at his student body unveiling Tuesday morning, none of the students knew it, but Tommy was portrayed by Superintendent of Schools Mary Alice Fletcher. So here you have the Superintendent of Schools inside this outfit saying that this is okay. But the fact is, the school board voted to approve this, and there were Native people on the school board. So again, it's one of these things where it's just not real clear sometimes what people are thinking or what matters to them. And if we're about local control, meaning the local community controlling what they do, well, they've got it, and look what they did. This is also really interesting. Non-Indians experience a boost in their self-esteem when they have a race-based mascot, as opposed to American Indians who largely have a loss of self-esteem when they have a race-based mascot. That's really interesting. Non-natives are so defensive about their native mascots. They love them. They are tradition. They've been part of their lives forever. They get bolstered by it emotionally, as opposed to natives who largely have a loss of self-esteem when they have a race-based mascot. Well, guess who's typically in power? Non-natives. What's the broader context of understanding contemporary images of racial or ethnic conflict or disagreement? Well, let's try and get smarter. The intellectual, critical thinking skills involved in contextualization of difficult and controversial issues helps teach future leaders to manage large groups or organizations with diverse opinions and personal backgrounds. So there are some benefits to change. Understanding different perspectives and compromises necessary between them for a peaceful environment. It helps us make informed choices that benefit the most people in the environment where we work or live. But what about the minority, or the least among us, who are marginalized as a result of the majority rule in democracy? Have you ever heard a chain is only as strong as its weakest link? That concept that one weak link can make that chain break. And the weak link in our chain is understanding what people of color have to go through. That brings up something else altogether. There are many compromises we could do. Stop using stereotypical cartoon-like caricatures. Stop the tomahawk chop and other fake Indian antics. Prevent schools from creating anti-Indian imagery when playing a team with an Indian mascot. Encourage using only a team's town name when referring to it in school-related media and public address systems. And it gets us up to the point that this potentially is a violation of Oklahoma tort law. Besides the personal rights mentioned or recognized under law, every person has, subject to the qualifications and restrictions provided by law, the right of protection from bodily restraint or harm, from personal insult, from defamation, and from injury to his personal relations. They might just be against the law, but nobody's pushed that. We're going to come back on Wednesday. I'm going to do part 2 of this talk. And we're going to go in some other directions as well. So with that, we'll see you Wednesday.